Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be diving into arrays in Bash. In many programming languages, arrays serve as a fundamental data structure, allowing us developers to store multiple values within a single variable. However, Bash handles arrays a little bit different compared to other languages like Python or C. A bash array is essentially a list of values where each of the values are assigned with an index starting with the value 0, but this might change depending on the version of Linux that you have. But by the rule, it always usually is indexed with 0. This makes it possible to efficiently manage sets of data such as file paths, usernames, command line arguments, and process IDs and more. Since Bash is widely used in system administration, automation, and DevOps, knowledge inside the working of such arrays is a crucial skill. Let us try to declare an array. To declare an array, you would basically follow up with a structure which looks somewhat like this. In this scenario, we basically are storing individual elements, which are these fruits, separated by spaces and not commas, and all of these values are encapsulated within parentheses. So unlike strongly typed languages, Bash does not require you to specifically declare an array type. And as you can see, the array basically is created by assigning values enclosed by parentheses and separated by spaces. And once you hit enter, you basically have created this specific array. Now once the array has been declared, we have the ability to retrieve individual elements with the help of index notation. For example, let's just try to access, let's say, banana, and when we hit enter, you can see that we have successfully retrieved the element banana. The same process can go ahead with apples, cherry, and so on. Here, bash arrays are usually indexed by 0, but since I'm using Kali, I am getting index value starting with 1. But in usual cases like in Ubuntu or any other distribution of the distro, the first element would always be indexed with 0, the second would be 1, and so on. If you try to access an index which does not exist, you will basically be returned an empty string value. In this case, you can see that since our elements are only 4, and when I try to access the fifth element, we basically get nothing in return. Similarly, if we want to print all the elements of the array, we can use a special syntax. Here, a special accessor element can be utilized, such as @ or star symbols. However, the usages can also bring about changes where the @ symbol basically treats all the elements as individual values, while the star or the asterisk symbol will basically treat the entire output as a string. So let's just try to access all the elements with this special syntax notation with the @ and once we hit enter, you can see that we basically expand to all the elements in the array, preserving the spaces within the values. We usually use double quotes when we try to access these values to prevent word splitting, which ensures that the spaces basically remain intact. This would basically break if the elements contain spaces and they are basically treated as separate words. If you want to find out the entire length of this specific array, we can use this specific notation called the hash before the specific variable term of the array, and once you hit enter, you basically expand to the total count of the elements in the array. This is useful whenever you are required to iterate over an array dynamically. Knowing the length would basically help prevent an index error. Now we will try to loop through arrays using the for loop in Bash. Loops are essential in Bash scripting as they allow us to automate repetitive tasks. Instead of manually processing each of these elements in an array, a loop would allow us to iterate over each of these values efficiently. Let's say the for loop is commonly used to loop through arrays such that we can process a list of files or directories, iterate over a command line argument, or automate operations on system resources. Basic syntax of for loop structure basically can be displayed over here. We will go into VI, go into insert mode, we will write bin bash, and we will write for variable in list of values. For that, we basically close it with a semicolon, and we will perform a set of commands over a span of time as the variable passes through the list of values, and we will basically execute a bunch of these commands. This basically is closed by the done. So here we can basically see two separate structures within the for loop. This is the first bit and this is the second bit. The first bit basically allows us to iterate over the list of values, while the second bit, starting with the do closed by the done, basically defines a block of code which basically executes for each iteration. Let's now apply this concept to one of our arrays that we previously defined. Let's say we have fruits. We basically call it a bunch of fruits like apple, banana, let's say cherry, mango, and so on. So here we will write for I in semicolon, double quotes. We will basically create our accessor element. We will write fruits within square brackets. Since we would like to treat each of these values as accessible elements, we will use the at symbol. We close it with a semicolon. We will open up the do, and for each of these iterations we will basically print out the value. So here we will write fruit followed by $I. Here $I would contain the value of that specific index for the specified array here, and here we will close it. So as you can see, we basically define this structure. We'll write and quit. We will write bash for loop asset and hit enter. This is the expected output, and the values are basically being printed for each of the iterations, and since there are 4 elements, you get 4 iterations. So as you can see, we will just go back and perform a quick breakdown again. We basically have defined an array which would basically store all of these multiple string values. We basically use I to iterate over the array. Here the accessor element has been defined, which allows us to expand to all the elements in the array. The loop assigns each element to the variable fruit, or I. In this case it could be any value in any variable term that you can use in the space, and here we basically execute the commands inside the loop, which is an echo statement which would print the fruit's name during each loop iteration. One of the common mistakes that you would like to avoid is to not forget the use of quotes around our accessor statement. This would break any array element which would contain spaces, and this would not basically treat it as an individual element. So yeah, always remember to keep double spaces, double quotes, and enough space between the for loop. An alternative looping methodology can also be utilized, where we might need both the index and the value. So for that purpose you can go ahead and we can basically modify the same code structure, and here we will basically write the exclamation mark before the fruits name of the array, which would basically specify um, that the index value is going to be displayed. So here we will write index and we will write $I, and here we will basically close it off and say fruits, and we will try to access these values by writing fruits square brackets I. And yeah, this is pretty much it. You basically close it, write and quit, go ahead and hit enter. As you can see, this is the expected output. Going back to our code, here dollar followed by the parenthesis with the exclamation mark basically retrieves all the list of indices, which is 0, 1, 2 and 3. So there are 4 index values. The next part is this part, which is another accessor element which would retrieve the element at each of the indexes I. So these could be apple, banana, cherry and mango. And yeah, that is basically how you use a for loop. So a key takeaway is that we basically use for loop with $array to iterate over values. We basically wrap each of these values within double quotes to preserve spaces in the elements. We can also use the exclamation mark before each of the terms of these arrays or names of these arrays to basically enable us to access the index value. So yeah, that's pretty much it for loops. The next segment we will basically dive into while loops. While loops in for unlike for loops are another form of common looping structure which basically provides us with more control. When will we use while loop over for loop? That's a very interesting thing. When you are asked to iterate over an array based on a specific set of conditions rather than the fixed list of values, you basically would choose the while loop. Whenever we are processing an input from the file, command or user input, we basically use the while loop. Whenever the loop needs to stop under specific condition, rather than to iterate across the entire elements of the array, we would basically set up the while loop. The basic syntactical structure of a while loop basically can be established similarly in another bash file. We basically write bin bash to bring in our bash interpreter. The basic structure for the while loop basically involves a condition specified within square braces. Just like the for loop, we basically set up the do and done, and we have bunch of commands which are specified for execution while the condition remains true. So this loop would run as long as this specific condition remains true, and the do and done bit of this entire block basically allows us to iterate over a bunch of commands. So yeah, let's just try to implement a practical use case. So let's say we basically have a bunch of fruits as before, and we basically store it within this array. We will write something like this. Here, since we would like to loop over these values so long as a condition remains true, we will have to specify a condition. So here we will set up a variable as an initialized index value, and we will set up the while loop, and the condition would be that as long as $I is less than the total length of this array, we basically specify the hash followed by the name of our array with the accessor element with a special unique tag called @. We will close this with the semicolon and we will use do to open up our code block. Here, just like before, we will specify some echo statement and we will try to access these values. Note, we would always like to increment our value of the initialized index value, else we will be stuck in a forever loop. So yeah, step by step breakdown of this entire structure is we have defined an array which basically stores multiple values. We basically have initialized an index variable. This would keep track of the current position in an array. We have defined a while loop with the condition where the loop would run while $i is less than the total length of the elements, the total length of the array, which is 4. And we basically get this value 4 from this specific accessor element prefixed by the hash symbol. Here we basically have the echo statement which would retrieve each of the elements at index I, and we would have to crucially increment to the next value for the next iteration to occur. So yeah, we will basically go ahead and save this and write. As we can see, one of the common mistakes that we might do as the user is that never to leave spaces, forget to add spaces whenever we set up the condition. So we will go back to insert mode and quit, and we hit enter. As you can see, the loop is successfully incrementing from one value to the other, and the next segment would involve looping through arrays by the use of until. The until loop is less commonly used than for and while, but it is useful in specific scenarios where a loop should contain until a condition becomes true. When to use until loops? Well, whenever the loop involves a specific condition and that is required to be met, and for that reason you would basically continue the process of looping until that specific condition is met. Whenever you are trying to work with dynamic conditions, or whenever you would like an event to occur before exiting the loop. So yeah, there are various use cases for this, so let's just show up what we can do with this with until dot sh. Go to insert mode, bin bash. The basic syntax of until loop in bash would basically look up something like this, where we set up the condition as before, close it with semicolons, we set up the code block with the do, and we will write something like this. So this is the structure where the condition basically is specified within the until block statement with the definition of the code block consisting of the do and the done. Unlike while, which runs while the condition is true, until basically would run as long as the condition is false and stops once the condition becomes true. So yeah, let's just try to implement a useful looping structure with the help of our old example. We'll set up our structure and go to cherry, and we will set up mango. So yeah, you basically have our looping structure. We write until 0, I equals to 0 as the initial index value, until $i is greater than or equal to dollar our accessor element, which is hash fruits followed by the @ symbol. We will basically perform the process of echoing out these values into the terminal. Always remember to increment your index variable, else we will be stuck in a forever loop. So here we basically have defined an array of individual elements of fruits. For the fruit array, I is equal to 0 is our index variable, which keeps track of the current position within the array. This segment of until $I is greater than or equal to the value of length of the array. This loop would run as long as I is less than the number of the elements in the array. -GE basically stands for greater than or equal to, would ensure that the loop would stop once I reaches the last index. Once that has been done, we basically retrieve the particular element value at index I, and we basically echo out with this particular statement. And here it is always essential that we increase the index value by 1 in order to make sure that we basically head on to the next iteration. Always remember, the condition statements always require spaces to be declared before and after the condition. So yeah, we basically go ahead, write and quit. We will write bash until sh and hit enter. As you can see, as before, we basically have moved on and executed and looped through the entire array. So yeah, key takeaways are that until loop would continue the execution as long as the condition remains false, and it would stop when it becomes true. This is ideal whenever we want to wait for a specific event to happen rather than iterating over fixed values. Here we basically use until with the condition -GE, which means greater than equal to, which basically allows us to loop through the index values. And yeah, this can be used with files and other specific conditions. So yeah, this pretty much wraps up for the various types of looping structures. There are many others, but these are the 3 primary ones, and I hope you understood and learned something today, and I will meet you in the next one. Bye.